Good evening. I'm with Bearing Witness. Tonight, we're reviewing records on fraud in Minnesota that have received little attention. We'll walk through what the documents show, why they matter, and who they affect. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Bearing Witness. As always, thank you for being here and for supporting this work. This channel exists for the victims, for accountability, and ultimately for the betterment of Minnesota. Behind the scenes, we've been working carefully, formatting, verifying, and organizing some of the most critical records and data tied to the Minnesota fraud that, to this day, has not been fully brought into public view by mainstream media. Our goal is simple: to make sure you understand the full gravity of what happened, what's at stake, and why correcting fraud in Minnesota is not abstract. It is urgent, and in some cases, a matter of life and death for the people most impacted. Real change requires public awareness. It requires people paying attention. And it requires support for the victims who have been asking for accountability for years. In that spirit, Bearing Witness has launched a dedicated website with in-depth reporting, original records, and comprehensive information on all parties involved, documents, data, and media tied to this case. After this video, you can visit fraud.thenorthstar.website to follow this series in full. Now, in our last episode, we walked through the executive summary of the Minnesota Office of the Ombudsman for Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities report, titled Just Plain Wrong. That report is available in its entirety on our website. After Just Plain Wrong was released, victims of the Minnesota Department of Human Services METO scandal took the next step. They filed a class action lawsuit. Today, we're going to examine that case in depth because this landmark disability rights lawsuit fundamentally changed how disability services are handled in the state of Minnesota. This is Jensen et al. V. Minnesota Department of Human Services. A timeline of broken promises. What happened after Just Plain Wrong? Jensen v. Minnesota Department of Human Services, one of the most significant disability rights cases in Minnesota history. In the rooted response to Just Plain Wrong, which made way for the publicly funded health insurance, Medicaid healthcare delivery programs we see trending in the media today. If you didn't catch it in Bearing Witness's first video upload, a detailed video on the burning of restraints in our public record playlist, and I'll have it linked for you in the description down below. Here's a short recap. In 1949, Minnesota put forth a media spectacle on Halloween, denouncing its voodooism, demonology, witchcraft, and the fearful barbarism stemming from its Salem witch trial days. This performative media spectacle created a false public perception that Minnesota appeared to turn a corner. On Halloween of that year, Governor Luther Youngdahl stood on the grounds of Anoka State Hospital and publicly burned hundreds of physical restraints, 359 straitjackets, 196 cuffs, 91 straps, and 25 canvas mittens. He declared that Minnesota had abandoned what he called barbarous devices, promising patients that they were understood, safe, and among friends. But as Minnesota's history of broken promises repeats, that promise did not hold. Despite this symbolic moment, the use of physical restraints, seclusion, and other aversive techniques continued in Minnesota institutions for decades, well into the 2000s, eventually giving rise to one of the most significant disability rights cases in the state's history. Conditions leading to the METO investigation. In April 2007, the Minnesota Office of the Ombudsman for Mental Health and Developmental Disabilities received a complaint regarding the Minnesota Extended Treatment Options Facility, known as METO. METO was a residential program for people with developmental disabilities, created by the Minnesota legislature in 1995 and located on the former grounds of Cambridge State Hospital. The caller was the legal guardian of an 18-year-old son who had been civilly committed to METO. She alleged that staff were routinely using 4-point restraints, including metal handcuffs and leg hobbles on her son. She reported finding bruises on his body shortly after his arrival and raised serious concerns about METO's use of aversive programming. She also stated that staff ignored her legal authority as guardian to withdraw consent for these techniques and claimed that METO staff coerced and threatened her to force her to sign off on an aversive behavior plan. As this complaint was under investigation, a second complaint was filed, alleging similar abuse. The Just Plain Wrong report. The Ombudsman's office launched a year-long investigation, conducting interviews with residents, family members, staff, management, case managers, and national experts in developmental disabilities. In September 2008, the office released its findings in a report titled Just Plain Wrong. The conclusions were severe. Investigators found that METO residents were routinely restrained in prone, face-down positions, placed in metal handcuffs and leg hobbles, and in at least one case, further immobilized with restraints secured behind the resident's back. The report determined that staff frequently failed to try any alternative interventions before using mechanical restraints. The data showed that 63% of residents had been restrained, many repeatedly. One resident alone was restrained 299 times in 2006 and 230 times in 2007. Even more troubling, restraints were often used in response to behaviors staff labeled as aggressive, including touching a staff member's shoulder, touching a pizza box, or talking about running away. The report stated plainly that these behaviors did not meet any definition of dangerous or aggressive conduct. Investigators also found that residents were placed in seclusion rooms for extended periods and were denied family visits. The Jensen class action lawsuit. On July 10th, 2009, the families of 3 METO residents, Bradley Jensen, Thomas Albrink, and Jason Jacobs, filed a federal class action lawsuit against the state of Minnesota. The lawsuit alleged that METO's use of restraint and seclusion violated the men's constitutional rights under the 8th Amendment, prohibiting cruel and unusual punishment, the 14th Amendment under the Due Process Clause. It also alleged violations of federal and state disability laws, including the Americans with Disabilities Act. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act, the Jensen settlement. On September 14, 2011, the case was resolved through a $3 million settlement. The settlement explicitly prohibited a wide range of practices, including mechanical restraints such as metal handcuffs, leg hobbles, flex cuffs, posy cuffs, and similar devices, manual and prone restraints, chemical restraints used for punishment, seclusion, pain-based punishment techniques. It also barred the use of psychotropic or neuroleptic medications for behavioral punishment. After a fairness hearing on December 1st, 2011, U.S. District Judge Donovan W. Frank formally approved the settlement on December 5th, 2011. The agreement required Minnesota and the Department of Human Services to work with the community to modernize Rule 40, governing treatment of people with developmental disabilities, shift toward positive behavioral supports, person-centered planning, and placement in the most integrated setting, develop an Olmstead plan in line with the U.S. Supreme Court's 1999 decision with measurable goals for community integration. METO officially closed on June 30th, 2011, but its successor facility, Specialty Health Cambridge, remained legally bound by the settlement. Judge Frank retained jurisdiction to enforce compliance. What happened next? Despite the settlement, compliance stalled. In July 2012, Judge Frank appointed David Furliger, a nationally recognized civil rights attorney, as independent court monitor, citing concerns about slow implementation. Furliger soon discovered that METO had been operating without a valid license. In December 2013, Judge Frank sanctioned the Minnesota Department of Human Services and again expressed alarm over delays. In September 2014, the court expanded the monitor's authority and extended jurisdiction through December 2016, citing continued noncompliance. In October 2014, Furliger issued a report documenting ongoing violations, including a man in a state-run home confined to his room 90% of the time, leaving only a few times per year. A woman in a licensed group home restrained in a restraint chair for up to 9 hours a day, without food or bathroom access. State investigations confirmed these findings. Furliger also presented evidence of widespread statewide use of mechanical and prone restraints, including practices deemed life-threatening in direct violation of the settlement. Judge Frank addressed these violations in orders issued in October and December 2014, underscoring that the struggle for enforcement was far from over. These victims at METO weren't made aware of their rights to leave, and reports found that many residents didn't need to be in a restrictive facility. But the fraud, settlement, and facility noncompliance still did not stop there. So let's truly dig into the Jensen settlement issue by issue and order by order. The Jensen Settlement Agreement, a federal court mandate reshaping disability services in Minnesota. Executive overview by Bearing Witness. The Jensen Settlement Agreement stands as one of the most consequential federal court interventions in Minnesota's disability services system. Issued in 2011, the agreement arose from a class action lawsuit, Jensen et al. V. Minnesota Department of Human Services, that alleged widespread, unlawful, and inhumane practices at a state-operated facility serving people with developmental disabilities. The settlement resulted in the permanent closure of an institution, the prohibition of restraint and seclusion practices, systemic regulatory reform, financial compensation for affected individuals, and the court-ordered creation of Minnesota's Olmstead Plan. Collectively, these outcomes transformed how the state of Minnesota is legally required to serve people with developmental disabilities. Recap of background and legal context. The Jensen litigation centered on conditions at the Minnesota Extended Treatment Options, METO facility, located in Cambridge, Minnesota. METO housed individuals with developmental disabilities who were placed there under state authority. Plaintiffs alleged that residents were subjected to illegal and abusive practices, including excessive restraint and seclusion, in violation of federal disability law and constitutional protections. The lawsuit asserted that these practices were not therapeutic, were not necessary for safety, and caused significant harm to residents. The case proceeded as a class action, reflecting systemic, not isolated failures in care, oversight, and accountability. In 2011, the matter was resolved through a federal court-approved settlement agreement, which imposed binding obligations on the state of Minnesota and the Minnesota Department of Human Services, DHS. Key provisions and outcomes of the settlement: permanent closure of METO. One of the most immediate and tangible outcomes of the Jensen Settlement Agreement was the permanent closure of the METO facility, Minnesota. Extended treatment options, METO, Cambridge, Minnesota. Closure date, June 30th, 2011. The closure marked a decisive shift away from large, segregated institutional models of care and acknowledged that the conditions and practices at METO could not be remedied through incremental reform alone. Prohibition of restraint and seclusion practices. The settlement imposed strict and comprehensive prohibitions on the use of restraints and seclusion for behavior management purposes. Specifically, the agreement barred mechanical restraints, manual restraint, chemical restraints, prone restraints, seclusion. These prohibitions reflected a recognition that such practices had been misused, overused, and applied in ways that violated the rights and dignity of individuals with developmental disabilities. The agreement required the state to move away from coercive and restrictive practices and toward approaches that respect autonomy, safety, and human dignity. Court-ordered development of Minnesota's Olmstead Plan. A central and far-reaching provision of the Jensen Settlement Agreement was the requirement that Minnesota develop a comprehensive Olmstead Plan. This requirement aligned Minnesota with the U.S. Supreme Court's decision in Olmstead v. which held that unjustified institutionalization of people with disabilities constitutes discrimination under the Americans with Disabilities Act. Under the Jensen settlement, Minnesota was obligated to ensure that people with disabilities receive services in the most integrated setting appropriate to their needs, meaning community-based living rather than institutional placement. The resulting Minnesota Olmstead Plan applies across state agencies and serves as a compliance framework governing housing, services, employment, education, healthcare, transportation, and community participation for people with disabilities. Modernization of Rule 40. The settlement also catalyzed the modernization of Minnesota's regulatory framework governing services for people with developmental disabilities, particularly Rule 40. As a result of Jensen, Rule 40 was updated to move away from punitive and restrictive interventions. The state adopted positive behavioral supports as the guiding model. Service planning shifted toward person centered planning, emphasizing individual needs, preferences, and goals rather than institutional control. This regulatory reform was designed to prevent the recurrence of the conditions that gave rise to the lawsuit. Financial settlement. As part of the agreement, the state of Minnesota agreed to a $3 million financial settlement for members of the plaintiff class. This compensation recognized the harm suffered by individuals subjected to unlawful restraint and seclusion practices and formed part of the remedial framework imposed by the court. Court oversight and jurisdiction. The Jensen settlement agreement was subject to prolonged federal court oversight. Presiding judge, U.S. District Court Judge Donovan W. Frank. Duration of oversight, nearly a decade. Judge Frank retained jurisdiction to monitor compliance, enforce the agreement, and ensure that the state met its obligations under the settlement. End of formal court jurisdiction. Jurisdiction end date, October 24th, 2020. On that date, the court formally concluded its active jurisdiction over the case, finding that the state had met the core requirements of the settlement agreement. Current status and ongoing implementation. Although formal court oversight has ended, the obligations and principles established by the Jensen Settlement Agreement remain embedded in Minnesota's disability services system. Continued implementation of the Olmstead Plan. The Minnesota Department of Human Services continues to implement the Olmstead Plan across state agencies. While no longer subject to direct judicial monitoring under Jensen, DHS has stated its ongoing commitment to the plan's goals and compliance framework, community-based support services. In response to Jensen and as part of a broader system reform, Minnesota established and expanded community-based support programs designed to prevent reinstitutionalization. These include Successful Life Project, Minnesota Life Bridge. These programs provide crisis support, stabilization services, and community-based interventions intended to help individuals remain in their homes and communities rather than being returned to institutional settings. Significance and legacy. The Jensen Settlement Agreement represents more than the resolution of a single lawsuit. It constitutes a structural reckoning with how Minnesota historically treated people with developmental disabilities and imposed enforceable standards for reform. The agreement ended institutional practices deemed unlawful and inhumane, forced the closure of a state-operated facility, prohibited restraints and seclusion practices, mandated statewide compliance with federal disability law, reshaped regulations, services, and oversight mechanisms. Its legacy continues through the Minnesota Olmstead Plan and the ongoing obligation to provide services in integrated community-based settings. Source documentation. Official court documents and supporting materials related to the Jensen Settlement Agreement are available through the Minnesota Governor's Council on Developmental Disabilities, which maintains public access to the case record and implementation history. Again, we here at Bearing Witness thank you immensely for supporting our website, online store, and social media channels. Your support helps us with the resources to continue you breaking this ongoing Minnesota fraud scandal story. Our work is focused on Minnesota public records, firsthand whistleblower reports, insider documentation of fraud, and internal processes that most news organizations do not track closely or contextualize. Because of that, we are able to identify patterns of fraud and procedural abuse that often go unreported despite their impact on real people. This work is for the victims, for accountability, and for the betterment of Minnesota. Until the next episode, signing off.